Continue this morning with the discussion that we've been having around not only Eskom but SOEs in general, the state of the country's state-owned entities, including Eskom, SAA, Denel, continuing to deteriorate, corruption and mismanagement being cited as the leading causes of the fall of these entities. Let's bring in independent analyst Rutendo Matinyarare, who believes that South Africa can learn lessons from neighboring Zimbabwe insofar as SOEs here in the country are concerned. Rutendo, let me thank you for your time this morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming into studio. And you've penned quite an interesting article that talks about the lessons that South Africa can learn insofar as SOEs are concerned and Zimbabwe's Zisco Steel. Tell us some of the sort of key findings you've come up with.
Right. Thank you so much for the opportunity. You know, for me, what I've realized is that many people in Africa don't yet understand how the world works. It's a race for resources, and capitalism is about captivating and capturing resources in order to build monopolies. And so what we saw with Zisco Steel was sabotage of Zisco Steel by monopoly makers. And these monopoly makers were companies like Anglo America, ISCO of South Africa, Lancaster Steel, and Woest Alpine, that was manufacturing the machines that were used in smelting iron and steel in Zimbabwe. Now, Zisco Steel is in many ways very similar to Eskom. Zisco Steel was the biggest steel and iron manufacturer in the Southern Hemisphere, the biggest in Africa, the biggest in Brazil, Australia. And what the problem was when we got independence, the Western world was not happy to bestow an African country with the ability to produce iron and the ability to sophisticate iron and to create military hardware and industrial hardware that would have industrialized Zimbabwe or Africa. The reason being, once the Second World War ended, there was a plan called the Morgenthau Plan. The Morgenthau Plan was supposed to deindustrialize Japan and Germany so that they would never rise to become superpowers that would challenge the Western world or the Western banking system. So what they did is they wanted to turn them into agrarian societies, take out their industry, block their mines, take their workers that were most technical and take them out of Germany and out of Japan so that these countries could never rise to industrialize. Eventually what happened is Germany's lack of development, Japan's lack of development made it difficult for the West to compete with Russia. It made it difficult for the West to compete with Russia, which was now bringing communism. So they were forced to allow Germany and Japan to develop so that Western capitalism could show as an example in these regions as a success. But for this Western capitalism to take place, for the Marshall Plan to be given to these Western countries to rise themselves up, they needed cheap resources. So what did they have to do? They had to now take the Morgenthau Plan, this underdevelopment plan, this agrarian society plan to Africa. And so that meant that they had to deindustrialize African countries that had just come out of colonialism to ensure that they'll never be able to sophisticate their resources so that those resources will be passed on.
So keep African countries
Absolutely.
sort of under your thumb?
Correct.
So that you can use them to your benefit.
And this is exactly what's happening here in South Africa with Eskom. Because you have to understand that Eskom itself was created by a private monopoly that was led by Cecil John Rhodes' company, the British South Africa company. And it created Eskom as private entities initially, where they were providing electricity to a lot of the mining industries. And with the biggest mining industry in the world in South Africa, you quickly developed the biggest electricity supplier in the world. So what they realized is that if you want to be the biggest electricity supplier, you have to consolidate all these small electricity suppliers and make one electricity supplier, which became the Victoria Falls Power supply company that was owned by Cecil John Rhodes. And if you remember, all British South Africa companies were then taken by Anglo America. Anglo America is the same one that we see having a problem in Zisco Steel. So Anglo America becomes this agent of sabotaging Africa to ensure that it doesn't industrialize and to keep the industrialization capacity in areas controlled by whites, which is why it lasted in apartheid South Africa.
So how does this play into the current state of Eskom, though?
Right.
Because when we talk about the current state of Eskom, we're talking about the state capture years of the past 12 years, right? How does this history help us understand what happened during the state capture years?
That's a false narrative. The state captures happened with Anglo America and white capital. And then this false narrative that a company like the Guptas that control less than 5% of the economy have captured the state is false.
How is it a false narrative, though? We've just had an entire commission of inquiry detailing how lieutenants of the Guptas and particular government leaders were put in Eskom and other SOEs with the chief aim of looting it, of hollowing it out through corruption.
The state inquiry is a farce. It's an embarrassment, quite frankly.
The state capture inquiry?
Yes, because it's false. That's why you see that even Glencore doesn't appear.
Wait, you're saying the state capture inquiry is false?
It's a farce.
The evidence that we heard for 2 years is false and a farce?
It was tailored evidence to manufacture consent to a certain narrative. But it's not true.
What isn't true?
It's not true that the people that were questioned on the State Capture Commission are the capturers of the state. You have a situation where Anglo-America controlled 60% of this economy, followed by the Ruperts, who controlled another 20%, and so forth and so on. How is it that people that have less than 5% of the economy captured the economy? How does that...
But the estimates are this morning, Rutendo, that hundreds of billions left our country through state capture. And there's forensic evidence detailing exactly that.
Where's the forensic evidence being tested for you to prove that as a reality? It is a narrative.
Well, we're living with the reality, aren't we?
So let's give you a reality again. Remember, we heard that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They were never found. And there was supposed to be evidence, because it was never tested, and there's this Western agenda to always make a story a reality that never gets tested. That's what we're seeing with the State Capture Commission. And I'm not saying this so that we just cause problems. I'm saying this so that you get to the root cause of the problem that you have in South Africa. And I'm saying Zisco Steel, Anglo-America was central to the destruction of Zisco Steel to maintain white monopoly and white capture. And let me tell you another thing. Whenever a society has had a crime against humanity happen against it, we usually have, for instance, with Nazi Germany, people being brought to book, people being taken to court and taken out of society. In South Africa, you've got a problem in the aspect that in South Africa, we had the very same people that perpetuated the crime against humanity still running society, running the media, running the companies, running banking, and continuously perpetuating the crimes of apartheid in a modern-day democracy by lies and doing the same things that were done during apartheid. We will never know the truth as long as the criminals of the apartheid system are running the economy for the same ends and the same purposes of apartheid, which was exploitation of the mineral resources of this country. And remember, Eskom was built off the gold, platinum, and exploitation of the diamonds of South Africa. And when the mining companies were paying for those services, they were not paying enough in order to allow for replacement cost in future. They were simply making money for the moment. What we've got now is that we've got an Eskom that did not save enough from the services that it gave these mining companies. Those profits went into the mining companies that are outside the country. Some of them are leaving because the gold is finished. Some of them are leaving because iron is finished. And they've taken the profits that should have been channeled into Eskom, that should have been part and parcel of the replacement cost and the depreciation of what Eskom would need to rebuild itself today. And the bankers have also sabotaged you in the aspect that the moment we get to 2017, you see a company called Future Growth that belongs to Old Mutual saying that we'll no longer give loans to SOEs, particularly Eskom. And so that started a regime of sanctions, of trying to bleed the government and not give it money to build its infrastructure. They also said they would influence other financiers across the world not to give South African SOEs and the South African government money. That is a regime change agenda. And that is an agenda to deindustrialize South Africa, as I've been saying with the Morgan
I have to interrupt you there, Rutendo. I'm trying to understand how you can erase 12 years of state capture by just dismissing it as a farce. Who exactly would be orchestrating this farce? And are you going to reply and say the West?
Well, it's interesting. How can we not erase 12 years if we've erased 135 years of state capture by Anglo-America and the companies that were formed out of the Cicero
Don't forget that
companies?
20 years ago, Eskom was an incredibly successful company.
No, it wasn't.
It was. We had electricity. Our maintenance program was on track. We had profitability. We were exporting our excess power outside of the country as well. You
were doing that while 70% of South Africa didn't have electricity. Many people were living in darkness in a country that was producing what you call...
20 years ago, not
yes,
27.
I'm talking about 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you did not have electricity for everybody. you actually had 70% of your people without electricity.
Yeah.